In chapter 3 of the book, In His Steps. What would Jesus do? And so we got into some characters. I just cut up to chapter 3 and I had a phone call. And chapter 3 goes, walk even as he walked. And we have a character named Edward Norman, and he actually made the pledge that day to do what would Jesus do in that year period and signed the agreement. And as he went back to his newspaper, he saw and looked at his newspaper and saw there's certain things that he probably shouldn't put in his newspaper, because what would Jesus put in his newspaper? And this day, on this Sunday, they were having this prize boxing fight on his paper, and also they were advertising a lot of advertisements for alcohol and cigarettes and things like that. And he thought, what would Jesus do? So he decided not to print the fight and the reaction to the fight, and not to have the advertisers coming, even though we're making a lot of money for him, not to be in the paper. And so the next day, the newsboys came out, to deliver, and they said, why isn't the fight in the paper? And another guy came in, Clark came in, and basically one of his reporters said, why aren't some of these things going in the newspaper? And he said, basically, we wanted a newspaper that would print those things that Jesus would print. And so the newspaper lost a lot of its subscribers, that's for sure. And would the newspaper lose money? Well, we'll find out as we go. In chapter 4, it goes on with the saloon, where the saloon was a bad area of town, and the saloon actually putting in advertisements in the gossip that went on in the midst of the newspaper on different fashions and celebrities and all these things that this guy, basically Edward Norman, said as he would have, I'm going to discontinue some of these things. And also, I am going to discontinue having a Sunday issue, and I'm going to actually let all my reporters off on Sunday, so they could go to church. And he basically said, Clark said, well, I don't know if this is going to work, but we'll see. The newspaper may go bankrupt. So there we have, in the midst of what would Jesus do? On to chapter 5. Basically, we see Henry Maxwell, the preacher, and he's wondering how Jesus would preach. And so as he gets ready to go and get up to preach, and in the midst of all of this, he realizes maybe that there's a different way that Jesus would preach. And what would Jesus do in the compromises for sin? Of course, he wouldn't compromise on those issues of sin. And then Rachel Winslow's there, and basically her too, thinking, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do in the midst? And Virginia Page, being that heiress there, what would Jesus want me to do with my money? Milton Wright, how should we do business? And so these other, as we go down, we see Mr. Powers in his machine shop there. And he's saying, oh, Jesus would probably want to be around his employees more. And so let's gather for lunch and let's pray and find out if these guys know the Lord, and basically witnessing to them on his lunch break. So, and gave a speech to the working men and invited the pastor to come the next time. And 300 men of his employees and other men came to hear the sermon on Jesus Christ, the gospel. What would Jesus do? Jesus would reach out to these men, and Mr. Powers wanted to bridge the gap between the employers and the employees. And going on into chapter 5, we have Alexander Powers, and his basically working for the railroad. He finds that the railroad is doing some things that are not very good, some things that are not high in integrity at all. In fact, he finds that the railroad is having this scandal going on, and how they can get out of paying the international commerce laws and following the international commerce laws, which had to do with the big trust, the big trust between the railroads. And at this time, in this century, that was happening, where the big business was taking over the railroads. Well, he stood up against the railroad scandal. And of course, you know what happens? He loses his job. He loses his job and he has to go back to being working with the Telegraph. And the Telegraph, his family are upset and all this, but he thought, I can't lie. What would Jesus do? On to chapter 6. It talks about Rachel Winslow and Virginia they were talking about forsaking all. It's how the Lord would have that in their lives. And Rachel Winslow is given this offer to sing for this big secular opera, getting together with this secular opera celebrity. They actually, her music and her voice is so good, they wanted her to sing and travel with them in this opera comic thing that they were putting together. And she would get paid a very large salary, and she was accepted, and they were waiting for her response. And she started praying, saying, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus want to be singing, traveling, singing secular? Or would Jesus want me to sing for him? And so in her heart, she thought, what would Jesus do? And she turned down this huge offer for her, and with a very large salary, as I said before. Her mother, of course, gets all upset about it. And in the midst of all this, she said, no, I want to do it, Jesus. I want to sing and lead worship music with my voice. I don't want to be singing in secular, theaters and bars and such like that. But she says, I want to sing for Jesus. On comes Virginia. Virginia, I said, remember, she's an heiress to this huge amount of money right now. And she doesn't really know what to do with her money. And she thinks, well, I just can't give my money to charity. What would God have me to do? So she's thinking about this too. Thinking, I don't have to work, but what would God have me do? I can't really do much. Although she has a fortune, right? But she's looking at, what would Jesus want me to do? And so Virginia's grandmother is Madam Page, and she sees what happened, basically Virginia taking this pledge, and she says to her granddaughter, why did you go up there to take this pledge? This is just fanatical. What do you want to do? In the midst of all of this, she basically says to Rachel, she said, why didn't you take the offer? You turned down this offer of your life? This is very impractical. And so grandmother is going to the pastor and saying, this is ridiculous that you're ruining these people's lives. But she did not take the pledge of what would Jesus do, of course. And on to the argument that she had with Virginia, and saying, do you mean that I don't act like Jesus because I didn't take the pledge? So really, in the midst of all this, it's kind of splitting the congregation in the midst of what would Jesus do. Chapter 7 goes on to Rollin. Who is Rollin? Rollin is Virginia Page's brother. He too inherited this fortune, as much as Virginia did, but he didn't know what to do. Basically, he wasn't going to church. He was out there partying away, puffing on his cigars and going up with the gambling with the elite crowd, and in the midst of all this, he does like Rachel. And so, in fact, he thinks, well, Rachel should like me, here I am, I have all this. But Rachel was actually kind of dating this other guy named Jasper. Jasper Page was a novelist, and he took the pledge. But Jasper really didn't take the pledge for Rachel. Jasper took the pledge, or didn't take the pledge for Jesus. He took the pledge for Rachel because he loved Rachel so much. He even had Rachel in his novels. And so we have Jasper, but we have Rollin coming on, and he's seeing Rachel and sees that, she took the pledge, he thinks it's ridiculous. and going on. In the midst of this, he's walking with Rachel, and he's just saying, Rachel, you know that, I've always loved you. And Rachel's thinking, what? And he's saying, why wouldn't you love me? And she's saying, well, look at your life. You have no hope. You have no future in the Lord, and all you do is like party and, go to these places and gamble and such, and so they actually divide there at that point. And Roland is, he's figuring that, of course, now Rachel, even though he liked Rachel, he actually loved Rachel, and Jasper too, loving them. Now we have this whole thing going on with this romance in the midst of this book, and Rachel thinking, what would Jesus do? She has a proposal from a young man that's a millionaire that doesn't know the Lord, and then the other young man has made the pledge, but he too has her in his novels, and his novel is very secular. It's kind of a romance novel. And so she's thinking, I just need to focus on Jesus. What would Jesus do? Going on, onto Rachel and her mother thinking, Rachel, you're turning into a fanatic, Of course, you need to make a living. So what are you doing? What are you going to do? And Rachel's thinking, I'm going to go down to the rectangle. Okay, here comes the rectangle. What is the rectangle? The rectangle is that part of the town where none of them go. That part where there's all the bars and saloons and partying down there, and a lot of homeless and just a lot of crime going into that Skid Row, that place, the rectangle. So now she says, I feel like going down in the rectangle and talking about Jesus. There's a tent preacher down there. Maybe I can join up with him. And the mother's like, oh, Rachel, you can't go down there with being around that sort of people. And so, again, you can go through that chapter. You can see as Rachel argues and her mother is giving her much, persecution about what she's doing. And so they decide to go down to the rectangle. The pastor says that would be a good idea and prays for them. And Virginia, the heiress, and Rachel decide to go down and meet Mr. and Mrs. Gray, along with Virginia's uncle, Dr. West. And the doctor has taken the pledge too. And so they all decide, maybe we should go down. Jesus would go down and reach these people for his glory, for the gospel. And so the rectangle, in the midst of these everything going down, and that you can see, but now in the midst of the tent revival going to happen, they're wondering, really, they're a little leery about what would Jesus do. So, and Rachel, so she doesn't know exactly what to do. She doesn't know how to preach. She said, well, what I could do is sing. But so when she starts singing, and all the people are looking, who are these, people coming down for the well-to-do section and coming down here? What do they think they're doing down in this section? And they're making fun of them. And in the midst of all this, Rachel starts singing. And when she starts singing, it says, where he leads, I will follow. I'll go with him all the way. And her voice is so beautiful that everyone's calm. They thought, we want to come to the tent, Minnie. Did you hear the voice coming out of the tent? On to chapter 8, that Henry Maxwell makes a list here of what Jesus would want him to do in the midst of his congregation. And he lists some things like live in a simple, plain manner. He said, basically, I don't need a lot of stuff, and I need to focus on Jesus. He would preach fearlessly, even to the hypocrites of the church, that it wouldn't matter of importance or wealth. And he would show in some practical form his sympathy and love for the common people as well as the well-to-do people, no respecter of persons. He would identify himself with the great causes of humanity in some personal way that would call for self-denial and even if he had to suffer, right? He would preach against what was going on with the alcoholism and crime in the midst of the saloons in the section of the rectangle. And he would become a friend and companion even of the sinful people to lead them to Jesus. And he also said he was going to give up his summer to Europe this year so he could focus on what the Lord would have him do. And he decided in humility to do all these things. He knelt down and prayed like a child, saying, what would Jesus do? He said he didn't trust in himself anymore, but just knew that he wanted to do exactly what God wanted him to do. Maybe he would go down to the rectangle and minister to the people. In chapter 8, we see the meeting there, the prayer meeting, and also onto the meeting in the tent. The meeting in the tent, as they go down there to where this lone evangelist and his wife are just ministering to the homeless people, and they decide that they want to come. Well, that Maxwell is coming down. Pastor Maxwell's coming down, talk to the pastor, and he says, I kind of like lost my voice. Why don't you give the message? And Maxwell's like, me give the message down here? So he decided to go ahead and give the message. What would Jesus do? And in the midst, as he's got up, like I said before, he gets up to give the message, and they're all making fun of him. Who is this guy thinking he can give this message here with us? He's up in the wealthy area of the well-to-do church, the first church of Raymond, and so they were making fun of him and suddenly Rachel again started singing. It was so beautiful. The whole crowd quieted down, and these dirty, even the drunken, and all just stopped. And as the pastor gave his heart on what would Jesus do, he talked about the Lord's love. He talked about the gift of the gospel, and all of the people came down, and people were weeping. And the last person that you'd expect to be there was Roland Page. Remember? He just came over from the club. He was clubbing and, going to the clubs and parties and stuff. And he just came over to see what Virginia, his sister, and Rachel were doing. And he starts listening to the message. And Pastor Maxwell did give it on what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? If in the midst of all of this, what would Jesus do in your life? Or what does Jesus want to do in your life? And he spoke as he never did before, feeling like Jesus was speaking, the Holy Spirit speaking. He thought, who are these people? They're immortal souls. What was Christianity? Is Christianity isn't Christianity a calling to sinners to repent? How would Jesus speak? What would Jesus say? Compassion for the multitude, he said, not just a theological question, but how to reach the masses of people. Tonight, he faced these masses and knowing that Jesus loved them and that he felt a genuine love for them too, which he had never felt before. He said, it's easy to love a sinner, but maybe not so much as a multitude of sinners. And so he asked the Lord to give him a heart for the multitude of sinners. So he said, what about this, these bars and these saloons and the alcohol and the parties and everything down here? How can we fight this monster? And he looked to Jesus and said, Jesus can. What would Jesus do? On to the next chapter, we started talking about the evening news again. And basically Edward Norman basically printing, about what was going on down the rectangle. He started printing about Christian things instead of secular things, and going on to the moral side of political questions. Because in the political questions now, there was votes on whether to allow these saloons and bars to go just rampant or basically to do away with some of them. But they had so many candidates for politics. The politics there were very evil. And so Edward Norman too thought, and plus, the other man thought, we need to stand up to these corrupted politicians. What would Jesus do? Isn't that what we have to do? Stand up to the corruption that's in politics. And again, Alexander Powers and his situation, we see of the railroad pooling and all that was happening. And now he would be persecuted, and so would the church, because he was standing against the corruption, and this corruption going in the political realm to very, very wealthy people that controlled everything. And knowing that they needed to stand up. What would Jesus do? He would stand up and stand up for what was right. On to chapter 9. And of course, we see that chapter talking about the Powers family and how he had lost his job. And the church comes in, but basically he finds his job as a telegraph operator. In the midst, they're all coming together. And one of the men here basically losing his job on another, in the Endeavor Society, Fred Morris, a young man, was out of the job because he had stood up, what would Jesus do? And so he says, well, you can go get hired by the news now, because the newspaper now, wants more about what Jesus would do in the newspaper. And so he gets a new job. On to Milton Wright in the stores. So he's thinking of his employees, and he comes and he says, you know what? I want a personal relationship with my employees. So he got together to help any employees that were having problems, and also to have a profit sharing type where they could share in the profit and they could all work as one family in their business. What would Jesus do? So Milton writes a pledge as a businessman. He said, I want to glorify God, not for the purpose of making money at all. I want to glorify God for Jesus' glory. So he wanted to put together trust funds and be loving and helpful and thinking of all, the souls that could be saved in the midst as he stood for Jesus, that he would pray with his employees to know the Lord. And he'd be unselfish and helpful, and shape a plan that would help the employees and the customers and the general business all together, working as one. What would Jesus do? To chapter 9, there was a change in business, as you can see, in the whole community because of what Milton was doing. And now, what would Jesus do? Was looked on all over the community, thinking, what is happening here? What would Jesus do? So, basically, a Saturday night came in the rectangle, as we see going into chapter 10, and the saloons were practically empty because all these people were coming to the tent meeting, to the preaching that was right in the midst of them. And they're all coming in to hear the gospel. There were 2 aisles of broken sinners coming down the aisles, asking Jesus into our heart. And in the whole situation, Virginia, the heiress, she was playing a piano there, organ there, and for Rachel, and Rachel was singing, and she saw a young girl, probably 18 or 19 or so, and she was sobbing. So Virginia stopped playing, and she went down and sat next to the girl and prayed with her, kneeled down, thinking, what would Jesus do? She had never done that before, you can imagine. And then Rachel turned her head, and guess who she saw was there? Rollin Page. And he was down at the altar. He was down there on his knees praying, but he was praying with a man that was half drunk there. It was a homeless guy, and he was praying with the homeless guy, and Rollin Page had tears in his eyes. Rollin Page was going to come to the Lord too. Virginia and Rollin. Both of them had come to the Lord. And chapter 10 goes, and if any man shall serve me, let him follow me. And Rollin indeed had come to the Lord. So here, but then we go to Jasper. Remember Jasper, the guy that was writing the the novels, and he had Rachel in his novels, and he decided, he did the pledge because he said he was going to do it, but he didn't do it for Jesus. What would Jesus do? He did it because Rachel did it. And so they walk from here. Of course, Jasper is there at this big tent revival, and all of these people getting saved, and miracles going on, and people coming off alcohol, and all these things. And she's walking home with Jasper, and Jasper doesn't talk about that at all. He just says, well, do you like my novel? I'm about finished with my novel. And then he said, you know I've loved you and everything. And Rachel, and he's basically trying to ask Rachel to marry him. And so Rachel, when he finally got it through, he was unmoved by the work of the Holy Spirit. He was just interested in Rachel. That Rachel looked at him and thought, wow, he doesn't really care about all this stuff going on with the Lord, does he? He only cares about me. He's just after a relationship with me. And she thought, what would Jesus do? So she said, no, and of course, Jasper is just like, what? I've been, I have you in my novels and everything. You're like my idol. Of course, and he was just mad, and he leaves thinking, maybe I don't want to do what Jesus wants me to do. And we go on with Rollin Page, just looking and thinking, no, I'm going to do what Jesus does. Remember Rollin, he loves Rachel, but he's not going to ask her again. And he's not considering following after Rachel. He's really considering following after the Lord. So now, in the midst of the church in Maxwell, we have 100 people now in Maxwell's church saying, Pastor Maxwell saying, you want to pledge? Remember, there was 50. Now there's 100 more people wanting to pledge. What would Jesus do in their life, seeing what God is doing there? And Maxwell's sermons had definitely changed. They had passion and earnest, and basically looking onto what would Jesus do at the First Church of Raymond. Maxwell's preaching was against, the corruption in politics, was against standing up against temperance, against the alcohol brought in, to these places. And at that time, it didn't have drugs like we do now, but alcoholism was so much, and how they could help these poor creatures looking to Jesus and get them out of this whole environment, which they would be tempted to go back into. So, and then we get into chapter 11. We have Donald March, the president of Lincoln College, and his scripture was, I found my cross a heavy one, but I must take a step. And so he stands up. He's an ethics and philosophy teacher, but he finds out, what would Jesus do beyond ethics and philosophy? So he says, I belong to a class of professional men who have avoided the duties of citizenship, basically not even getting into politics. Our city officials are corrupt. They're unprincipled set of men, and they control the city. What would Jesus do? So he knew he needed to stand up for what would be done in the city and take a stand against the corrupt politicians. So he indeed gets persecuted, as you can see. He wanted to battle against corruption. As he goes on, we see back into the rectangle, we see Virginia and Rachel going every night to the rectangle, not just on, every night, except for Sundays, but going every night, and the gospel being preached, and Rachel singing her heart out with worship, and so many coming to the altars. And of course the battle though began, because the politicians, they wanted to keep the saloons and such there. And so the battle was going on politically, and they were riling the people up on purpose down there, and bringing in people that would rile up the other people so that they would have a riot. And so in the midst, you can see what's happening. I'm going to go on to the next, we're going to go through the book. I'm already up to like chapter 11, but so here we have Virginia, has all these friends that are very well-to-do, fashionable women. She's she's a millionaire, you know, and they're following her, and they said, well, let's go. What is happening there with Virginia and Roland? Look at them, you know, let's go. Maybe they'll take us in there and we can go slumming with them. Maybe that we can see what's going on. And so they do take Virginia and Rachel, they do take these ladies down to, you know, to the Rectangle in their coach. And while they're in their coach, Virginia's friends, they want to look on, and as they're looking on, Virginia sees this young girl that she has prayed for at the altar. She sees her coming out of one of the bars, all drunk and all so drunk she couldn't even stand up. And so she says, oh, she goes, now, of course the other girls are saying, whoa, can we help or what? And so Virginia gets out, and she takes her and helps her through, and getting her out in the midst to get her off alcohol. And we'll see how Rachel, and as these girls are looking on, they're thinking, what is she doing? She's taking that drunk lady home? So let's go on to the next video. I'll find out what happens next.